Constructive alignment is an outcomes-based approach to curriculum design. The constructive element relates to the fact that students are placed at the centre of the process and construct their own meaning and understanding of the curriculum based on the learning experiences which they encounter. That doesn't mean that the tutor leaves the students to their own devices to simply learn the curriculum. The tutors need to articulate to the students what they're expected to achieve. In other words, what they'll be able to do as a result of taking the course. This is articulated in the form of learning outcomes. Teaching activities are designed to provide appropriate opportunities in relation to those learning outcomes, and in order to test whether a student has achieved the learning outcomes requires the setting of some form of assessment tasks. The alignment bit as such refers to the relationship between the three elements of learning outcomes, teaching and learning opportunities, and the assessment tasks that test the learning outcomes. So let's look at how we might think about designing a unit based on the principles of constructive alignment. Remember, we've got three main things to think about: the learning outcomes, the teaching and learning opportunities, and the assessment tasks. But it may be helpful to think about them in a slightly different order. We could start with the intended learning outcomes, and then we could think about the modes and methods of assessment that we'll employ to test the learning outcomes, and finally we could move on to think about the methods that we'll employ to deliver teaching and learning opportunities that should enable our students to achieve those learning outcomes that will be tested by the assessment tasks. Okay, let's look at each of these elements in a little bit more detail. There are a great many drivers for our learning outcomes. These are the main ones that I can think of here at MMU. Obviously there are the programme learning outcomes that need to feed into the learning outcomes at the level of the unit. There are the requirements of professional bodies where appropriate, and also the requirements of the MMU graduate outcomes that are set by and specified in the employability curriculum framework. And indeed there are the requirements of employees in general. We should also give some consideration to subject benchmarks if they're available to us, and all of these things need to be couched in the specific requirements prescribed by Equal. So our learning outcomes must be mapped to the graduate learning outcomes, and we have 5 learning outcomes to play with for a 30 credit unit. So in addition to all of those drivers, we should give some consideration to setting learning outcomes that test appropriate cognitive skills. And one way of doing this is to write them with reference to a taxonomy of learning such as Bloom's. This is basically a classification of levels of learning development, and we'll come back to this and look at it in a little bit more detail later in the guide. When we come to think about assessment, we have to keep in mind that we're aiming to test the extent to which the students can demonstrate the learning outcomes. So in designing our assessment strategy, we have to make decisions relating to the purpose of the assessed activities. So how will we use assessment to diagnose learning needs? To what extent will we provide formative feedback, and how will we produce summative grades in relation to student achievement of the learning outcomes? We have to select appropriate assessment methods for each of these given purposes, and there are a series of drivers that we have to take into consideration when doing this. Equal allows us only 2 elements of summative assessment. There are also principles set out in the MMU assessment framework to guide us, and there are also requirements set out in the MMU threshold standards that we need to adhere to. So for example, each programme needs to ensure that every student has at least one formative assessment within the first 6 weeks of the start of the programme. So if this is the unit that's chosen to deliver that formative assessment, we need to build that in. But also students need to be advised, according to the threshold standards, on the level of achievement in respect to unit outcomes in summative tasks. So we have to make sure that we're addressing that through our assessment criteria. We need to set clear assessment criteria to be used in our marking process. The assessment criteria needs to be transparent to our students and integral to the feedback that we provide for them. So in relation to that, we need to keep in mind that we're assessing the extent to which our students have demonstrated achievement of the learning outcomes. So in that respect, the learning outcomes are our metrics for assessment. Once we have a clear idea of our assessment strategy, we can start to think about providing our students with learning opportunities through the delivery of our teaching to underpin their engagement with the assessment tasks that we've set. We need to make decisions about the pedagogical approaches we'll adopt to provide appropriate learning opportunities that relate to the learning outcomes being assessed. We need to make decisions about the level and the use of face-to-face contact time, how we'll utilise the online environment such as the institutional virtual learning environment, and the extent that we'll adopt a blend of these to provide flexible support for student learning. This can be linked nicely to our feedback strategy, and it's useful to think about this in the context of supporting the assessment strategy rather than simply the content of the curriculum. Our teaching can best support summative assessment where it's focused on students actively doing things and has a strong diagnostic and formative role embedded in it. We can then start to think about the need for and the content of lectures, seminars, practicals, etc. This is a really complex process. The three elements of learning outcomes, assessment, and teaching and learning are interdependent. However, we need to recognise that the learning outcomes drive the design process. The requirements are equal in limiting both the number of learning outcomes and the number of summative assessment tasks to test them means that it's going to be very important for us to write our learning outcomes so that they communicate very clearly to our students what we expect them to be able to do when they have completed a course and how they will be assessed.